Swimming is my meditative escape, a way to clear my mind and process the world around me. During the pandemic, when gyms and pools were closed, I discovered cold open water swimming. Feeling sluggish and stuck, I joined a friend in the icy lake, sometimes even breaking through ice to swim. Swimming in freezing water is now my sanctuary, where I do my best thinking. On pivotal dates like January 6, 2021, when rioters stormed the Capitol, or during the congressional hearings investigating that attack, I found myself in the lake, reflecting. I was on a recent swim when I noticed a house along the lake with a large Trump 2024 flag that read, "No more bull." It unsettled me, disturbing my meditative calm that I rely on during these swims. Trump has never been my guy. I've often criticized his behavior, his dishonesty, and his inability to admit wrongdoing. Seeing that flag reminded me of my disappointment that so many Americans have elected to give Donald Trump a second chance in the White House. But as I swam, something shifted. This is not just about frustration, it's about opportunity. It's a sign. It's a call to listen. From West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, this is Us and Them, the show that tells stories about the things that divide us and bring us together. I'm Trey Kay. Listening, deep, empathetic listening, is at the heart of what we do for this show. When Donald Trump first won in 2016, we spent time talking to his supporters, trying to understand their perspectives. Over the years, others have tried similar approaches, often with mixed results. Comedians like The Daily Show's Jordan Klepper have gone to Trump rallies to mock supporters in gotcha moments. And while those clips might elicit laughs from some people, they haven't changed minds or bridged divides. On that recent cold water swim of mine, I knew I needed to engage in a different kind of listening. Not to debate, not to ridicule, but to, as Leonard Cohen once said, listen so hard it hurts. I decided to start with the owner of that house on my swimming lake and his "No more bull Trump" flag. Summoning my courage, I knocked on his door and introduced myself. I explained that I'd seen his flag and that I didn't share his views. I admitted my disappointment with the election outcome and told him I believed people with my views hadn't done a good job of listening to people with his views. I asked if he'd be willing to talk with me and share his perspective. He wasn't particularly receptive. He expressed anger towards liberals, immigrants, and what he sees as democratic failures. Me and my redneck buddies are locked and loaded, and we're ready to take the nation back, he said. He ended our brief conversation with a handshake and a parting comment, "Vote Republican." Then, without closing the door, he turned away to take a telephone call. I walked back to my car, deflated. My hopes for meaningful dialogue felt futile. But as I sat in my car, I realized something. Listening, even when met with resistance, even when it hurts, is still essential. Not everyone will engage, and some conversations will end in anger or frustration. But there are more doors to knock on, more people to listen to, and more opportunities to understand. This work isn't easy, but it's necessary. In a divided world, listening is one of the few bridges we have left. I shared this interaction with Liliana Mason. She's a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University and co-author of the book Radical American Partisanship: Mapping Violent Hostility, Its Causes, and Its Consequences for Democracy. She wasn't surprised when I described my interaction.
Tucker Carlson isn't going to Whole Foods in Brooklyn and trying to figure out what these liberals are thinking, right? He's not interviewing them desperate to understand their motivations. He just doesn't like them. There's not the same curiosity on both sides.
Mason is part of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation at Johns Hopkins University. It's made up of historians, sociologists, and political scientists. They research ways to support democracy and share it with the public in a way we can easily understand.
I give a lot of talks at colleges. And so after one of the talks I gave, a couple of students walked up to me and they said, hey, we're the presidents of the college Republicans and college Democrats. And we're constantly trying to get together, get our members together to have a conversation. And it never goes well. It's terrible. And what should we do? And how can we have these conversations better? And I said, stop talking about politics. Go build a house, right? Go work in a soup kitchen. Go do something together that helps somebody else, that doesn't help you, that you're all working towards the same goal. And when you have a project and you're all working together, then maybe you'll understand each other enough as humans to talk about politics in a respectful and decent way. But you're going to come at politics right now with the talking points, exactly like your neighbor did, right? He came at you with just the main talking points from what he hears on TV and radio and on the internet. He gave you the lines that he hears over and over and over again. We're all just throwing these lines at each other without hearing anything that the other person is saying. Republicans feel laughed at. They feel condescended to. They feel like Democrats don't respect them. And Democrats, as you felt when he said locked and loaded, are worried that we're going to get shot by Republicans, right? And so that's part of the psychological process. It makes it hard to come to the table when you're afraid of somebody. And it's even harder to come to the table when they're actively threatening you. So these are all serious barriers that if we could think of each other as human beings, they wouldn't be there. But it's really hard to get rid of them in a way that makes everybody feel respected and physically safe at this point. And that's a really hard problem to solve.
So when you're talking about how America has basically clustered, we have red states and blue states, and red states are really red and blue states are really blue, that in many ways we don't challenge ourselves with an opposing opinion or a worldview that's different than ours, that in many ways what we do is demonize, perhaps ridicule people who are the other and make them into an enemy. And I think in many ways, just basically take away all of their humanity.
Right. And this is research that I've been doing recently, looking at how Democrats and Republicans feel about each other on a more kind of radical level. And this is based in research that people have done in other countries. And one thing that we know is that in countries where the political divide is aligned with, first of all, is aligned with ethnic or religious divides, the chance of violence increases, which is exactly what's been happening in the US. But also, what I found in my research is we ask questions like, do you think the people in the other party are a threat to the United States? Do they agree with the statement, they're not just wrong for politics, they're downright evil? And we even ask them whether, they deserve to be treated like humans because they behave like animals. And what we found was really high levels of support for these survey questions. In dozens of national surveys that we've done over the years since 2017, we basically have found that 80% of American partisans think that the other side is a threat to the country. About 50 to 60% say that they're evil, and about a third are willing to dehumanize people in the other party.
You say that there is a hollowing out of the social spaces that reduces the opportunity for people to be calm and engage in constructive dialogue. Tell me a little bit about that.
So first of all, identities are involved in this too. When we have a lot of identities that are kind of all consistent with our party identity, and the party is threatened, we get more emotional, right? We react more emotionally than we would if it was just our party that's being threatened. And so the people who actually have the calmest reactions to politics are those who have cross-cutting identities. So they're a member of a group that is mainly the other party, right? And so they get to see people from the other party as kind of more human and more accessible to them because they share that identity with people who just largely are their political opposite. And these cross-cutting identities used to be everywhere, right? In 60 years ago, they were all, tons of people had them. They basically characterized our politics. And now we've sorted to such a degree that those cross-cutting identities have disappeared. And so the people who are left that have them, we can measure how they react to politics. And when their party is threatened, they feel less angry. When their party wins, they feel less happy, right? They don't react with as extreme emotions as people who have these more sorted identities. And so those people can actually kind of think about politics in a more rational way than people who are really reacting emotionally to things that are going on.
Before the election, Us and Them held an event at Marshall University to talk to students about the presidential campaign. We asked students about their hopes, fears, and their trust in the system. One common theme was that many young people don't feel like they're being heard. And with the average age of a U.S. senator at 64, many young people don't see their ideals reflected in these older generations.
This is a new generation ran by older generations. And as they are great, their way of thinking doesn't fit into what's going on now.
It was very clear for a very long time that President Biden was not a popular candidate for this general election. And as that kept being ignored and ignored, I felt very disrespected and ignored by the party.
I wanted to follow up with some students post-election to see what they thought about Donald Trump's victory. Bella Lane is a sophomore at Marshall University. She's 21 years old and has a 22-month-old son. This was the first time Lane was eligible to vote, and she says she proudly voted for Trump. Before Donald Trump was elected a second time, did you feel that you had to keep your political thoughts or views to yourself when
Yes.
you were on campus? Well,
Yes.
Tell me about that.
I just feel like there were so many women who were just so pro Kamala Harris, and it almost just felt like the extremist side would be the side I would encounter every single time. And it would be like, I'm not talking to an extremist. I'm not. And then you have like people that are quiet about it. And I just felt like the more people that were quiet were more pro Donald Trump, and they didn't want to say that they were pro Donald Trump. They'd keep it to themselves. I have a friend who was in class, and he has a class at Marshall, and one of his buddies asked him who he voted for, and he said Trump, and a girl behind him started like yelling at him just in class, and she was like, "You're just calling him names and saying he was stupid." So I just didn't want to encounter any of that, so I definitely kept to myself.
Lane then told me a story about how she chose to display a pro-Trump Make America Great Again hat after the election.
After Trump was announced and when I had classes, I like just put my MAGA hat and clipped it onto my book bag on the back so I could walk around with it on my book bag.
As opposed to putting it on your head.
Oh, no, I would not put it on my head. I was like afraid that one of my teachers, who's like definitely liberal, she's younger, that I feel like she would have made me take it off. But I also didn't want anyone coming up to me and like punching me in the face or something, because I was like, I don't want to do that.
So in a way, if somebody's looking closely, they know that A, you supported Donald Trump, and that you would characterize yourself as MAGA.
Yes. That was also after, like, I don't know if you saw any of the viral videos of like mainly women, like, and they were like shaving their heads and they were like having mental breakdowns on the internet, which I understand, like that is sad. Like the person that you loved and you wanted to be in charge of America lost. I'm not making fun of them in any way. But as a woman, being characterized as most of my guy friends and like adults that I know, they think that like all women voted for Kamala. And I was like, no, I don't want to be characterized as that. I did that because I didn't want to be looked at as, oh, she's a woman. She's definitely like heartbroken.
But
No.
you were concerned. You said you didn't put it on your head.
Yeah, I wasn't going to put it on my head. I feel like my teacher would have made me take it off. I had a speech that day as well. I had to give a speech. So I wasn't going to wear it giving my speech.
Did the speech have anything to do with the election?
I chose my topic way before the election. It was like we had to choose a topic to do 2 speeches on. One was an informative, and the one that I was doing that day was a persuasive, and I chose why voting was important. And I just feel like my message wouldn't have really been received with the hat on my head.
How do you view your fellow classmates who didn't vote for Donald Trump?
I still see them as like a person, a human with emotions. Like they voted for what they felt like they wanted to vote for and what was going to help them the most and what they cared about the most. So like I don't hate them for voting. I'm glad that they did vote. Get your voice out there. Get what you want out there.
At the Marshall event, we heard from a young woman named Olivia Andrew Vaughn. She spoke about student activism around the Israel-Hamas war.
When you're looking for what's motivating young voters, I would look towards activism and issues they're passionate about, and this is just one example. But one significant form of activism we've seen in the past year driven by youth is protests surrounding the U.S. government and institutions' support of Israel's genocide in Palestine, but neither major political party seems to be listening.
I wanted to follow up with Olivia as well to see how she felt about the results of the election. How did you feel about the outcome of the election?
So right up close to the election, we talked about in one of my political science classes what people were expecting. And like 2 days before, I had gotten to the point where I kind of had a feeling that my home state, Michigan, I thought Trump was going to win, which is one of those important key states. And I thought if he won Michigan, he might end up winning the election. So I wasn't ridiculously surprised by the outcome. But there were definitely like pieces of his platform that I just was really disappointed to know were going to be implemented, although both campaigns had not really run on a platform that I was really excited about, or I felt really optimistic about what they were hoping to do, especially with the Gaza genocide. Trump's was further from what I was looking for. So that was a little bit disappointing to see that after inauguration, there might be some choices that I'm going to have to really figure out like how to grapple with and how to still kind of get my voice out and support the things that I believe in when the administration really doesn't have the same goals. I think something that I've seen common along a lot of people is this kind of disappointment in the directions the parties are going in general. And I definitely experienced that.
How do you feel about people who have a different point of view about the Israel-Hamas war than you do? How do you feel about people who disagree with you?
But I think there's a lot of people who aren't very educated about the issue, who haven't been able to form super strong opinions or who haven't really been educated on the issue that I don't want to say, oh, you're a horrible person because you have a different view than me. I think the focus for me is on trying to help people kind of see my point of view and understand why we should be letting our politicians know that this is something that's important and pushing for U.S. foreign policy to align with what we believe is right and what we're passionate about, what is right. And that's why I think things like the student protests are so important, because you can see this really passionate group of people that know this is something that is unacceptable. There are so many civilians that are dying, and the U.S., we want foreign policy change. And I think that that's really important. But I don't think saying someone who disagrees with me or doesn't feel as strongly or hasn't paid as close attention to it, I don't think saying you're an awful person because of that is a very good take.
How do you view others who would support Donald Trump?
I don't really typically try and say just because you have a certain political stance that I'm going to view you a certain way. It's kind of once we get into the nitty gritty of the why or the different aspects, then I can say, oh, wow, I really think that you don't have a stance on this issue that I think aligns with my moral beliefs. And I can absolutely make that assessment, but I really don't like to make that assessment up front just based on I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat. I voted for Trump, I voted for Harris. I think being able to converse with someone and dive a little bit deeper is really important, especially in a society that is so divided.
Coming up after a break, we'll hear from Professor Jonathan Zimmerman about how free speech has been challenged on some college campuses this year. And Professor Liliana Mason will share some thoughts about the next 4 years.
The things that Trump has already promised to do would be extremely, extremely damaging. And someone needs to stand up against that. So you can't lose hope.
I'm Trey Kay, and you're listening to Us and Them. Our show is supported by the CRC Foundation and the Daywood Foundation.
In difficult times, music gives us peace, brings us together, and helps heal us. It calms our nerves and brightens our days. That's why we're bringing you classic episodes of Mountain Stage on air and in our podcast. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find something that's familiar or brand new and feel the power of live music on our website, mountainstage.org.
Hey, I'm Trey Kay, and this is Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Outside the election, another event has dominated news headlines this year. The Israel-Hamas war. College campuses across the nation have seen protests. Demonstrators call for a ceasefire and the end of financial ties with Israel and partnerships with Israeli institutions. College protests are nothing new. In the late 1960s, more than 1,300 colleges like Columbia University, UC Berkeley, the University of Wisconsin, and the University of Chicago saw protests over the war in Vietnam. In the wake of the most recent student protests, it seems many colleges are reconsidering their policies on free speech and open expression, which is worrisome not only to students, but to educators. Jonathan Zimmerman, a tenured professor at the University of Pennsylvania, wrote an opinion piece called How One University Lost Its Way on Free Speech. It's a reaction to the new rules that the University of Pennsylvania put in place after student protests in 2023. Those demonstrations began on October the 7th after Hamas fighters launched an attack into Israel.
These guidelines include, but are not limited to, the requirement that you need 2 days' notice to get permission to hold a demonstration, unless you want to do it in a heavily trafficked area, in which case you need 2 weeks' notice. It also includes a ban on, quote, violent speech, and, most astonishingly to me as a child in the 1970s, a ban on the use of sidewalk chalk. I well imagine that many of the people who support this code, this ban on violent speech, imagine that they're protecting Jewish voices because there was anti-Semitism, more expressions of anti-Semitism on our campus. But every single rule to restrict speech will come around to bite you in the rear end. We've discovered that large fractions of our students are afraid to say what they think, in class and out of class.
There's data from the Philadelphia-based Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE, that shows students are afraid to express their opinions on campus. One West Virginia University student said, quote, "I feel as a conservative, my opinions are silenced for fear of being called names or assumed homophobic, racist, conspiracy theorist, etc., etc. In class, I cannot freely disagree if it goes against the expected norm." As an educator, this is something that Zimmerman is worried about.
It is a problem if you care about education, because the entire premise of the university, including, by the way, the diversity premise, is based on the idea that we'll all learn more if we're sharing our ideas with each other. That was the rationale for affirmative action. No matter what you think about affirmative action, I agree with the premise, which is that all of us will learn more if we bring different and differently minded people to campus. I'm a professor, Trey. My job is to maximize learning. And if the individual in your example isn't sharing what they think, my goal is inhibited, right? My purpose is inhibited. I want people to learn, and they will learn more if we're all sharing what we think.
Data from the Philadelphia-based foundation known as FIRE ranks the University of Pennsylvania 248th out of 251 schools in its annual college free speech ranking. West Virginia University is ranked 97th. Why is UPenn at the bottom of the list?
Well, look, let me just say, even though I'm an advocate for FIRE, I understand that their rankings are, let's just say, contestable. I can't make a plea for the veracity or the accuracy of their rankings, but I can tell you what the system looks like in general and why we got a low score. What the rankings reflect is, first of all, that survey literature about what the students say about the tone of dialogue on campus and the level of freedom or not that they feel to express themselves. And then also they count things like deplatforming episodes, and also they count penalties against professors. And so that was, I think all of those were components of our low ranking.
With regard to what happened on October the 7th in 2023 and the retaliation from Israel, that has sparked a lot of protest on campus, Berkeley, Columbia, here at UPenn, Michigan, all over. First of all, can you tell me how that played out here on this campus in Philadelphia?
Well, the way it played out is there were a lot of protests against Israel's bombing of Gaza. There were a smaller number of protests, mostly by Jewish students in defense of Israel and in defense of its right to self-defense. Eventually, the anti-Israel protesters set up encampments, and eventually the university called in police to take away the encampments and also to arrest a small number of people. Some of whom were Penn students, several of whom were not. What I just described is something that played out with some variation at a number of different campuses. But here's what happened, Trey. We didn't leverage that moment. What happened is people started to protest, and then at Penn, this created an incredible reaction, especially among the alumni and the trustees, and some extremely powerful trustees with names like Mark Rowan, who's, by the way, one of the richest people in the world, this incredibly successful private equity guy. He started saying things like, I can't believe the scourge of anti-Semitism on campus, and I can't believe we're allowing this. And he started calling for Liz McGill to step down.
Liz McGill was the president of the University of Pennsylvania. She resigned over mounting pressure in December 2023.
And there was, and I think continues to be, a culture of fear. And, until October 7th, I did not appreciate what a powerful thing fear is. I do believe fear is the enemy of learning in all times and places. I think people don't learn well when they're afraid. And I think we don't really get a chance to leverage our differences and to speak across them if we are afraid. And I think since October 7th, fear has been the dominant motif on our campuses.
What I understand happened here at Penn and at other institutions across the country, that you heard protesters who were saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, right, or globalize the intifada. Some say statements like that are calling for the elimination of Israel and the Jewish community. Is that something that should be protected speech on a college campus?
My answer is absolutely yes, but I want to make clear that I completely understand why some people would hear those statements as anti-Semitic or even as eliminationists. I'm also Jewish, and sometimes I hear those statements the same way. But My feeling about those statements is not a good reason to ban them. And let me say even more. Some of the people who correctly, I believe, say that these statements should be protected are the same people who, before October 7th, were saying, we have to restrict racist speech on campus because it targets vulnerable populations and makes them feel unsafe. Has it occurred to these same voices that now people are saying exactly the same thing about globalizing the Intifada or from the river to the sea? Of course, that's precisely the argument they're making. I think pre-October 7th, it would have been fair to say that it was Democrats who represented the major threat to free speech. Now, I believe the threat is bipartisan, and that's precisely what makes it so powerful and so scary.
What if here on your campus there were some people in button-down polo shirts carrying tiki torches and saying Jews will not replace us, like in Charlottesville?
Yeah. And look, again, everything depends on context and time, place, and manner. So again, we have 100 years of constitutional jurisprudence about these questions. You can restrict people's speech, not just if it creates like a direct threat of violence, but also if it interferes with the day-to-day workings of the institution. So Trey, I can't go outside of dormitory with a giant microphone and scream into it all night. Why not? Well, the reason is it's going to keep everybody awake, right? Is that a limit on my speech? It is. And it's what we call a time, manner, and place restriction. And again, we can debate kind of the lines there, where those restrictions should be. I'll give you another example. You can't stand up in the middle of math class and just start screaming invective at the teacher. Is that a restriction on your speech? Well, of course it is, right? And I think most reasonable people would say that's a legitimate restriction because that's not the time or place for this. In class, you do have to maintain a certain sort of decorum so everybody can learn. Again, we can debate where these lines should be, but I think all rights are limited in some way. The only interesting question is, where should the limits be?
Okay, but what if the university, to protect safety, would say, geez, if something were to go sideways, at least we did take this precaution to have the students register so that if something happened, we can show that we did take precautions to protect themselves from legal liabilities.
Look, the people that run these institutions have extremely hard jobs. I am really glad I'm not them. And to your point, I understand their rationale and I understand their own fears about, quote, what could happen. But, one of the costs of democracy is a certain kind of risk. Democracy is messy, inchoate, and unpredictable. That's what it is. I wish we could find a way where we could embrace and celebrate that instead of trying to restrict it because of, quote, what might happen. I understand their impulse, but at the same time, I bemoan it because I think that impulse, it reflects the fear of the moment and it creates a culture of fear on our campuses. I think they're trying to cover their loins in the event that there is some violent happenstance and somebody says, well, what were you doing? Why weren't you minding the store? I don't think it's their job to mind the store. We're adults here, man. We're citizens. We can vote in elections. We can die in wars. It's not the job of the university to manage either our speech or our feelings.
According to the 2025 free speech rankings from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, there's a large list of topics that students say they have a difficult time being open about on campus. Those topics include abortion, guns, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You teach classes that really were about tough culture war issues like abortion and guns. Do you still teach those type of classes? And do you have that type of dialogue here?
I do, but my classroom isn't Penn, right? First of all, it's my classroom, right? And I have extraordinary power within it. Thank God, a full professor with tenure. So I can do what I would like within my classroom, and I've continued to do that. And I feel incredibly fortunate and privileged to do it. So I'm not complaining about my own circumstance at all, but I am deeply concerned about the climate of discussion, or the lack thereof, on the broader campus. So October 7th should have been the ultimate teachable moment, in the sense that we should have used it to educate ourselves and each other about the event. And by the way, there are campuses that did this, and I think quite successfully. So you may have read that Dartmouth College, the day after the event, they invited 2 professors from Jewish studies and 2 from Middle East studies. And those people sat on a stage in the main auditorium of the campus, and they sent out an email saying, like, if you want to talk about what happened, there are going to be 4 people in comfy chairs. They're going to be sitting up there talking. You want to talk with them, do it. And hundreds of people came. And then they did it again, and it was like thousands if you expect all the people online. So I think they really leveraged the moment. But I think most of us were unable to do that. And the reason is that we were afraid of the emotion of the moment.
Well, it seems like a minefield.
Of course it's a minefield, but every difficult issue is a minefield, right? And this issue in particular, because, we were talking earlier about how the climate of these schools, especially the elite schools, is overwhelmingly on the blue side, on the politically blue side. But, Israel-Palestine is one of those issues that actually divides the blues. So it should be, like I said, a great venue for discussion and learning, precisely because it's about something we really disagree about.
And when I first met you, you were at New York University. And sometime just before you left NYU and came to Penn, another person that I got to know, Jonathan Haidt, who is a social psychologist. And he wrote a book and several articles about how it seemed like a lot of the students that he was encountering at NYU wanted to feel safe in their classroom, and that they wanted to have a trigger-free environment. And if I remember right, in his articles, there were times where he, who is a pretty renowned person, this was a guy who, if I'm not mistaken, got called on the carpet because students were complaining about him maybe talking positively about a political perspective that was not shared by many of his NYU students.
Which proved John's point. I mean, look, I think that he's onto something. And I think what he's described is something that I call the psychologizing of politics. And I think this is very different, Trey, from the time that you and I grew up in. The psychologizing of politics, to me, that refers to the phrasing of political claims in psychological terms. So if you don't like something I've said about Israel, Gaza, or whatever, you don't say, I think you're wrong for the following reasons. You say, you have triggered me. You've microaggressed me. You've made me feel unsafe. And I do think that language is relatively new. And I will say that, like Haidt, I think it's a kind of cul-de-sac for political discussion, and I would say even for learning. Look, Trey, we're having a conversation right now. And if you were to tell me that you've been microaggressed or triggered by something I said in this conversation, I'd have exactly one thing to say in reply. I'm sorry. And I would be. Like, you're my friend, and I don't want to harm you in any way. I mean, even if you weren't my friend, I wouldn't want to harm you. But my point is, that's all I could say. I couldn't say I didn't harm you. How would I know that? I can't look into your soul or your psyche and tell you that. And that's what makes this such an impossible venue for discussion. To use a very loaded term, it's a trump card, right? You harm me. And by the way, Trump himself says a lot of stuff like that too. You're very mean to me, very, very nasty to me. You hurt me. And there's not much you can say in reply. When I give this rap to my undergrads, they often bridle and they say, you're denying our feelings. And my response to that is exactly the opposite. It's the undeniability of your feelings that make this such an impossible venue for discussion. It's because I can't deny your feelings that we can't really have a talk, because real discussion requires a kind of denial. It's like, okay, I know you said this about Israel, but I actually think you're wrong, and here's why.
But this type of culture that is looking for a trigger-free zone and that where you can call a professor out for microaggressions, Does that fall into this whole idea of cultivating an environment that doesn't foster free speech?
Oh, yeah. I think these things are deeply connected. I don't think they're unique to us. I mean, I think that this really comes out of what I see as a very salutary development, which is the greater awareness about mental health. What we're talking about right now is an unfortunate and I think unexpected byproduct of that. So just to be clear, Trey, I'm not against psychology. I just don't think psychology and politics play well together. So I think it's great there's more awareness about mental health, but the problem is we've tried to apply the metaphors of mental health to politics, and it just doesn't work. Or I guess you could say in a more cynical vein, it does work. What it does is it dampens political discussion because people are afraid of causing harm. And I'd go even further. If you tell people over and over again that they've been triggered or microaggressed, you know what? They're going to feel that. They really are. And I don't know how that helps them. If you went to your therapist and you described some problem and your therapist grabbed you by the shoulders and said, "You were traumatized, you were traumatized, you were traumatized," I think that you would be within your rights to fire your therapist, if not to sue them, right? That's not going to help you. And I fear that with all these metaphors, we've done a version of that on our campuses. We've actually taught people a set of what sociologists call feeling rules, which are the scripts, the social scripts that influence without determining what we feel. If you're in an environment where lots of people are talking about getting triggered, I think it's more likely you're going to feel triggered.
Do you see any evidence that suggests that administrators or your colleagues are interested in making changes to foster diversity of opinion and comfort in expressing ideas?
I want to be very careful here because I absolutely have some colleagues that have expressed concern about the fire report and have expressed concern about, let's just say, level and quality of dialogue on campus. But I think they are minority voices. I think that as a rule, university professors are very conservative in a dictionary sense. They're not conservative politically, as we were talking about earlier. Most of them are liberal politically. But they're conservative in a dictionary sense in that, they don't like to rock the boat. And they, I think, are often afraid, to go back to that metaphor, to question authority. I feel this quite acutely when I write a piece that criticizes university authorities, and somebody will come into my office and close the door and say, "God, you had such guts to write that piece." And, I always respond with the same answer, which is, I don't have guts, I've got tenure. What is it for? And even though, Trey, I know that comment is offered as a compliment, and I take it as such, it also makes me extremely sad. Because what's the person saying, really? What they're saying is they feel a certain amount of fear and inhibition, right? God, you had such guts, or some other body part, right? It's like, no, but what are you so afraid of, right? That's really the question, right? And I think what they're afraid of is the judgment of their colleagues and school leaders. Remember, university professors have good reason to be conservative in this way because we're all judged by peer review. So when you write an essay or a book, you submit it to other people in your field. And when you go up for promotion, letters are solicited from other people in your field about you. So I think one of the reasons professors are so conservative is that in some ways our lives are governed by our reputations among our peers. And people don't want to inhibit that.
Americans are in a different informational space now than they have been in a long time. And not only is it different than before, but it's different from each other.
That's Liliana Mason again, political science professor at Johns Hopkins. She says that our fragmented media landscape creates different realities. So in a way, we're living in silos or echo chambers, and in many ways, there is not this cross-intersectionality, right?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of we aren't hearing from people that we disagree with as much, and we also are choosing to be in informational spaces that we don't necessarily demand tell us the truth. And so a lot of the kind of newer media spaces that people are in, don't have the same standards that traditional journalism does, right? So like the New York Times and Washington Post, they're required to tell the truth. And when they mess up, they have to issue a correction and say, oops, we messed up. These other places, podcasts, far right-wing media sites, they don't have to do that. They don't have that commitment, and no one is policing that for them. And so it's easier to surround yourself with misinformation without even realizing that you're doing that now.
In the past, I've seen some of your studies and work that look at a question of whether the psychology or the mentality in both parties is more about winning as opposed to whether it is for the good of the society, the good of the nation. How does that factor into what we've been talking about with the election and whether it's tribal loyalty?
This is like a really deeply rooted human motivation, is that we want, first of all, that we identify with a group. We need to do that in order to form societies and communities, but also that we want, once we identify with a group, we want that group to win. It feels really good when they win. It feels really bad when they lose. And in fact, the status of the group is connected to our own sense of self-esteem in the world. So it's very important for us, for our groups to win. And in experiments that were done in the 1960s and 70s, it was demonstrated repeatedly that when asked to choose between a situation in which everyone in the entire experiment in both groups gets more, or you get less, but the other group gets less than your group, that they choose the condition in which they have to sacrifice the well-being of everyone in order to get status, right? So the actual amount of stuff that you get is less important than the difference between your group and the other group.
What is there the possibility that everybody could get the same, but you want your group to get more?
So an example is like, you can choose to give everybody $5, or you can choose to have your group get $4, but the other group gets $3. And people, even when they're assigned to a brand new group that they didn't even know they were a part of, will choose the condition in which they are higher status than the other group, but actually overall well-being is less. But now, because we have these very strongly identity-based parties, even if economic indicators are telling us that our party is not doing well, we still vote for that party. And we don't pay as much attention to performance. We aren't holding the party as accountable, because it's so hard for us to vote against our party, because everything that we identify with is looped together with the status of the party. We're not just voting for whether our party wins. It feels like we're voting for whether our racial group and our religious group and all these other identities are also winning. And that makes the stakes much higher.
Dr. Mason, it seems as though we've been through like a whirlwind and a kind of a whipsaw back and forth in this process, from Joe Biden drops out and it goes to Kamala Harris, and there's assassination attempts in between. It's been a lot. And for some Americans, especially the people who do not support Donald Trump, it seems as though we're going into the new year and perhaps the next 4 years with a feeling where hope is just diminished. And I'm wondering what you might think of that. What are the things that we should be looking for as we move into the new year?
The first and most important thing is that, in general, authoritarian regimes want their people to feel hopeless. It is helpful for authoritarianism and fascism for individuals to feel powerless and like there's nothing they can do. And if Democrats' worst fears about a Trump administration come true, we will endure severe damage to our democracy. The things that Trump has already promised to do would be extremely, extremely damaging. And someone needs to stand up against that. So you can't lose hope. The second possibility is that what Democrats are afraid of doesn't happen. So many of the Trump supporters didn't believe that the things he was saying. They didn't think he would actually do the things that he said he would do, like imprisoning his political rivals. And if they're right, then there will be less damage than Democrats expect. If they're wrong, and it is as bad as Democrats expect, those people are going to turn against Trump also, right? They didn't sign up for the amount of authoritarian progress that is likely going to be the thing that Trump pursues. And so I do think that very quickly people will learn that he's, what he's doing is not what they actually wanted him to do, especially if he's increasing tariffs and deporting millions of people. I mean, not only is it immoral to deport millions of people, but it will deeply harm our economy, and people are sensitive to that. In authoritarian regimes across the world, people resist it and they live through it and it ends. And so, the worst case scenario is we have to keep trying. And the best case scenario is it isn't as bad as a lot of people expect it to be. I do think that losing hope is the worst possible thing you can do. And I think retaining your principles, retaining your values, knowing what you stand for, knowing what you'll tolerate, what you will not tolerate, all of these things I think are going to be important. And it's hard to live through history, but I think that that's where we are right now. We're in a whole chapter of the history book, and we have to live through it and hopefully emerge as the people who preserved democratic institutions.
What is the Chinese proverbs? May you live in interesting times.
Welcome to the interesting times.
Yeah, welcome to the interesting times. You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this show was me, Trey Kay, Samantha Gatzik, and Kate Smith. Special thanks to Professors Sean Schulenberg and Mary Beth Beller of Marshall University, Deborah Temple for helping me take pictures around the lake where I swim, and special thanks to Bill Bishop, the author of The Big Sort, Why the Clustering of Like-Minded America is Tearing Us Apart. Michael Lipton, Tristan Lozow, and Ahmed Solomon wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation. Hey, we'd love to get your thoughts about this episode. Would you share them with us on our Facebook page or on X, which is formerly known as Twitter, at Us Them Podcast? Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. Farewell to 2024 and best of luck for us in 2025. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.